we're going to go over Joshua and Judges tonight. That remark I made about it for first-timers, yeah, this is, I suppose you said, it's certainly not very Christian books, because there's no such thing as Christianity at the time of these books. When I taught high school and taught all the books of the Bible, girls especially didn't like Joshua and Judges at all, because it was so violent. Boys kind of thought it was cool. Anyway, and my first thing is, these events are more than 3,200 years ago. There's certainly no thought of loving your neighbor, and certainly no thought of getting along with people you don't know, you consider to be enemies. And certainly women are nowhere even close to being considered to be equal people. So, I mean, those sorts of things come along much, much, much later, pretty much after the time of Jesus. So this is a time where the values of people and the culture of people and the practices of people are way different than later on. And the authors don't condone the behavior. They say, this is what it was. So if people ask today, why is there so much fighting in the Middle East? Well, it starts in these books that we're covering tonight. So, over 3,200 years ago. Now, the years that I put down on there, the closer you get, the lower the numbers get, the more confident we are in the time period. From 722 on, we're sure of the years. Before that, reasonably close. Before 1000 BC, much less. We know for sure, by the way, just for a round number, 1000 BC is when Jerusalem was settled. But in the events today that I talk about, 1200s to 1000, some people say it's earlier than that, but we have no way of knowing for sure. When we get to the time of the kings, there are references to other kings from other places, and we know when they were kings, so we can piece together the timeline better. The things from Moses through Joshua and the Judges, we give our best estimates. We do know the order, but we're not exact on the years at the beginning. All right, so has anybody ever been at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C.? Is there a picture? Is there a sculpture of a biblical figure there? The most known military figure in the Old Testament is Joshua. So I haven't been there, but I've read that Joshua is the one whose sculpture is there because that's what he does. He's their military leader as they head into the Promised Land. So when the book of Deuteronomy ends, Moses dies. He is named Joshua as his successor, and Joshua is going to lead them into the Promised Land. So that is how the Torah, the first 5 books, ended. So Moses was the main character there. Now Joshua is going to be the main character for the next 20 years or so. So, I said it's probably, if you read the introduction to the book, that gives you a good idea of what the book is about and why it's in the Bible. So, for example, many people, after they read these 2 books, will say, wow, why is that in the Bible? Well, so 2 answers. One is, it covers the story of the Israelites from earlier. When you start with Moses, we're going to go through these people to get to David and the kings and so on, and then eventually all the way to Jesus. So it's a running story. Second of all, we do say that it also symbolizes the spiritual conquest that comes along later with Jesus. So what Jesus will do spiritually, but these people do militarily. We want to make that analogy. All right, so historically, and again, same thing, the farther along we go, the more accurate we are with dates, also with historical actions. So there's more than one writer in this book. Sometimes in the book it'll say, this happened, and it's still there to this day. So that tells us that the author is writing from a certain time about things from the past. And if they're saying that this is still the case to this day, and later on it isn't, well then we can kind of say, all right, somewhere in between there is when that book was written. Numbers, though, are always exaggerated, and numbers usually represent something. So always take numbers with a grain of salt. anything with a 3 or 4 or 6 or a 7 or a 12 or 100 or 1,000, they all have a symbolic meaning, but there's no way these numbers could be accurate. Obviously, there'd be nobody left if as many people died as it says here. The desert couldn't support as many people as it says here. So the authors do that as a way of making a point. The larger the number, the more important they're saying something is for the most part. So, all right, so we'll start with Judges. And it talks about a quick review of what Moses told us. And then, in the middle of chapter 1, it says, the Trans-Jordan tribes. That was a Final Jeopardy question I got right once, that in 1948, trans was removed from this country's name. Okay, it was Jordan. It's just called Jordan today. It used to be called Trans-Jordan. Trans is across the Jordan, and that's what it means here. That 9.5 tribes are going to be on the west side of the Jordan, and 2.5 are going to be on the east side of the Jordan River. So they call the 2.5 on the other side the Trans-Jordan tribes. Remember when last time I told you, you ever see a map of how the Jews go from Egypt to Israel, like here's Israel, here's Egypt, and they go like this. And actually when they enter, they're going that way to cross the river. So the 2 reasons for that, one is this land in between is mostly desert, so you're not going to travel through the desert because you probably won't survive. You got to go where water is. So they follow a path that's sustainable for them to get there. And also sometimes they have to zigzag around where other people live. But they don't want to fight until they get there. And anyway, remember when they get to the promised land, but they don't cross it yet, Moses can see it because it's on the other side of the river. And then he dies. All right, so now they're ready to enter, and already they're talking about how some of them have said, hey, we kind of like it on this side of the river. So 2.5 of the 12 tribes will stay there. All right, they still go, and Joshua sends some people to check out the first city that they're going to go to, which is Jericho, which, by the way, is one of the oldest cities in the world. However, we're not sure, at the time of this, Jericho maybe wasn't even inhabited. So we're not sure what time period we're talking about here. And if it's Jericho for sure or what. But it's another trivia question. Jericho was the oldest city in the Promised Land. But anyway, whatever city it is, it says, all right, they send some scouts to check it out. And they go into the town, and then they're coming. People kind of figure out who they are. So they're in trouble. But they're at the house. It says of the harlot Rahab. Harlots were people who ran public housing. So if you were a traveler and needed a place to go, that's where you would go. So they weren't, today we often think of harlots as prostitutes, not necessarily. Okay, they were the ones who ran public housing. Anyway, it says that she tells them, I can sneak you out of here as long as when you come back you don't kill me or anybody in my family. And they say, okay, yes, we'll do that. And they say, here's what you do to designate your house, so that when we come, we won't bother anybody in this house. You, your siblings, whoever you want in the house, will respect that. And she lives on the edge of the city. As a matter of fact, the city has a wall. And the wall of the city is the wall at the end of her house as well. So she puts a rope down and they go down the rope and get away. So that's the story of Rahab. And there are a few women mentioned by name in the Old Testament, just to remember, because later on they're mentioned again. As a matter of fact, when they give the genealogy of Jesus, they mention 3 non-Jewish women. So anyway, I think Rahab is one of those. So just to keep that name in mind, that's who she was. So anyway, they go back and give their report to Joshua. And then in, that was chapter 2, and then in chapter 3, he does the preparations, he gathers the 12 tribes together. Says, remember, we're one here, eventually we'll divide up into our 12 tribes again, but there's some things we still need to do together. They cross the Jordan River. All right, so it says that when they walk across the Jordan River, when the priest carrying the Ark of the Covenant touch the water, that it does like when Moses parted the seas, that again, and then they cross over on dry path, again to show that this is what God wants. The Ark is very special, but this is the moment that we've been waiting for. And by waiting for, I mean going back centuries to Abraham. Abraham was promised two things, land and descendants. Okay, he thought he was too old to have a son, died, and they had the son Isaac, and then Isaac had two sons, one of whom was Jacob, and then Jacob had 12 sons, which become 12 tribes. So the promise of descendants was fulfilled several centuries earlier, but not the land. Abraham was shown some land. That's where they're heading to. But now, centuries later, they're finally going there. That's why we call it the promised land. It was promised a long time ago to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and now finally under Joshua, we're going to enter. So they do enter. They make a memorial marker there on the spot where they enter. So that's the crossing of the Jordan River with the ark and the priest leading the way and everyone going across. Then they do some ceremonial rites and make like I say, a marker where they crossed. And then, since it says Jericho is the first city, they lay siege to the city, and they fulfill they're faithful to their promise to Rahab. The story is they prayed around for 7 days, and the walls fall. In all likelihood, that simply means they probably laid siege to it for 7 days, and then went in and conquered the city. And it says that they did not do any harm to Rahab or anybody in her house. All right, if you go back to some of the instructions in the first 5 books, it says some things such as you have nothing to do with any of the spoils you take from any of these places. You don't take any of that, you just destroy it. And some of the reasons for that is, okay, you know, it's foreign people, foreign rights, foreign gods, don't have anything to do with that. So when it says that they destroyed the city and everything in it, they call it, they say if they put the city to doom, that means they get rid of everything in it. And you're not supposed to have anything to do that. Okay, then the second city, town called Ai, or Ai is how it's spelled. All right, it says they go there and they're unsuccessful in their first attempt to take the city. And it says they lose 36 soldiers. All right, and then so first I'll tell the story literally, what it says, and then what that means. So they say, what's the deal here? I thought God told us that we were going to be successful in doing this. And here, you know, we had success, we got Jericho, but now what's the deal that we were unsuccessful in our attempt to take the city of Ai? And then they figure out, you know what, I bet someone violated the promise we made to God. I bet somebody took something from Jericho. Anyway, there's this guy named Achan that says, yes, that's true, I did. I did anyway. So they take him out and they stone him to death. And then they advance upon the city a second time and they're successful. So whether that happened exactly that way or not, the authors want to make the point of, no, you don't take the spoils from the other places we take. That's just something you don't do. God doesn't want you to do it, so don't. So Achan was the name of that guy, and that story is told in chapter 7, the first unsuccessful attempt. Then Achan's killing, then in chapter 8, the successful second attempt to take the city of Ai. All right, it seems that the Jews are getting a reputation that the peoples around there are kind of getting scared of them. So in chapter 9, where it says confederacy against Israel, the Gibeonite deception, people from the town of Gibeon say, well, we certainly aren't going to be able to protect ourselves against these people. So let's send a delegation to them and make peace with them. Pretty unusual for that time. So they do that. They go, And they meet with the Israelites and they tell them, we've heard great things about you. Let's make a deal so we don't have to fight. And the Jews say, yep, that's fine. And in exchange, they're like vassals, which means they make very friendly trade deals or whatever with the Jews. The Jews are obviously the higher up partner in the relationship with the Gibeonites, but they make that transaction. The only thing is, when they find out, they thought that the Gibeonites were going to be their neighbors. They're on the border, and they find out, Gibeon is actually within one of our 12 tribes. They're in there. However, when you make a promise in the Bible, a vow, you can't break it. So they say, all right, you'll be among us, living in our land, because we promised that we weren't going to kill you when we made a deal. So when it says the Gibeonite deception, the deception was they implied that they were from farther away. So anyway, to get it. So anyway, that one ends peacefully, and they apparently at least live together peacefully. Talks about there are all kinds of peoples in here. Now later on, the Philistines are going to be the one that give the Jews the most problems. We're going to hear about them for centuries. But here we hear many other groups too. Remember, when you talk about a king, that'd be like a mayor of a town probably today. I mean, we're talking about a very small area, not many people, not much power. It's just your local main person. So when it talks about how they capture all these kings, they might only be a few miles apart. But they make a list of them and where they're from, like the Amorites or whoever. All right, and then it talks about the conquest of the land. So they go from place to place. It seems like they do pretty well in the south. They get that part first. Then that's chapter 10, and then in chapter 11, the Northern Confederacy, some of the northern kings or local leaders of that area get together and say, maybe we should make an alliance here. We can hold these people off. But that is unsuccessful. The Jews take over most of the land. At least that's what it says here. We find out a little bit differently later. So Joshua is successful in all of those things. And then in chapter 12, they list all the places that they captured. So if you got out a map and they were all listed, you could go through them. But that would be a very easiest thing to do. And again, these places are extremely small. So the first part, the first 12 chapters now in Joshua, said that we not only entered the promised land, but we conquered most of the land that God wanted us to have. So, now that we've got that land, we need to decide who's living where. Because we want to live with our tribe, clans, relatives, whatever you want to call them. So beginning in chapter 13, where it says division of land, Joshua says he's pretty old by this time, but he's still the leader. He says, okay, we're going to divide it up. And it says they do it by a lot, which means kind of like drawing straws. But maybe whoever goes first, you get their first choice. Okay, and when it says the eastern tribes, okay, that's the 2.5 tribes that are on the other side of the river. They were involved in the capture of the land. When they told Joshua, hey, we're happy settling here on the east side, Joshua told them, okay, but you've got to participate in our occupation. You've got to participate with your soldiers and all. With the rest of us, after we win, then you can go back. So they held true to that deal. So it talks about the 2.5 tribes there that do that. Reuben, Gad, and then I believe half of Manasseh or Judah. But anyway, that's the 2.5 tribes on the east side are described in chapter 13. And then in chapter 14, the western tribes, the 9.5, they're on the western side of the Jordan River. And even today, that's the best land when you hear the West Bank. Okay, it's the West Bank of the Jordan River because it's the most productive land. You're in a desert country, so land along the river is the best land. And if you were to fly over Israel and see the colors, around the Jordan River, it becomes pretty green. green, and much of the rest of the country would be brown, so that's where the best land is. All right, so they divide that up, and then in chapter 15, the borders of each one. Judah is one of the largest tribes. As a matter of fact, later on, when the country divides in half the country is even called Judah. But anyway, that's the largest of the 12. It says they gave a specific piece of property to Caleb, if you remember who he was. Remember when we go back to the last time when they sent 12 scouts to check out the land. 10 of them came back and said, well, I don't think we can do this. 2 came back and said, yeah, guys, with us, we'll be able to. Those 2 were Joshua and Caleb. So Caleb is still alive, so as a reward for his faithfulness, they decide, yeah, we'll make sure you're well taken care of. We'll have a nice place for you. Then they go over some cities of Judah. All right, and then they list them all. Look at all this. How long this lists are. It makes it sound like it's a huge country. So again, a lot of these places, talking about a very small place, smaller than Anthem. In the case of probably all of these, Anthem would be a pretty large city at this time. All right, so Ephraim, Manasseh, Joseph, those are all one of the 12 tribes. I remember when I first year I taught, one of the students said, what's this with these names? They have names like Naphtali and Manasseh, and then Dan. So anyway, what they do, they just have, some of them have simple names like Dan and Joseph, and other ones have more complicated names. But those are all named Benjamin, Simeon. All right, so those are your 12 tribes. Anyway, they're telling you where each one lives. And then at the end of chapter 19, Joshua's going to die pretty soon, but we want a nice place for him in his final time, so they have a place for him as well. In chapter 20, cities of asylum. You know, what is an asylum, or a place of refuge? It says there, okay, if you ever accidentally kill somebody, you go live in a city. This city is set apart for you. Because remember, this is still time for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You know, if you kill somebody, then you get killed. But they said, well, what happens if you accidentally kill somebody? You know, and they say, well, yeah, you know, you probably shouldn't be killed, but maybe you lose your freedom. Go live. All right, we'll set a city aside for you. So you're safe there, but if you leave the city, you leave there, and then you're open game. So that's what a city of asylum is. And then in chapter 21, it says the Levitical cities. Levites are the priests, the descendants of Aaron. So instead of getting land, they get cities. So it's a place for Levites. And Levites are supposed to be the priests, or eventually are the priests when they settle in. So that's why the Levites are mentioned separately. All right, and then they give us a little few more places too here, cities of the other Kohathites, the city of the Gershonites. These are other peoples that live there. So, you know, we haven't conquered all of them, we are living with some of them. And then in chapter 22, we got the land settled. Over the course of about 20 years, we estimate, over the course of 20 years, these things have happened that we talked about tonight. So in chapter 22, Joshua says, all right, we'll get everybody together. I think we're okay now. We don't need a specific successor to me. Each of the tribes has its own place. You can take care of yourselves, hopefully. And those 2.5 tribes, yep, you're officially dismissed. Thank you for your participation in our efforts here. And you can go back to your places. In chapter 22, there is an argument there. I think that when they went back across, they built some kind of an altar, and the other side interpreted that as kind of seceding from the rest, like we want to be separated from you. But they say, no, that's not what we did. We just wanted a place to honor God for the fact that we're here. And they settled that, okay. So in chapter 22, that is taken care of. And then chapter 23, as is often the case when a major figure dies, he gives a last major speech in which he summarizes much of what has happened during his lifetime with special regard to how God has been faithful to them. So he says God was faithful to us all the way back to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. But faithful now, especially now though, it's especially faithful to the covenant made with Moses on Mount Sinai that we made with him. And we promised then to be faithful to God, so we need to make sure we do that. And God has always been faithful and will continue to be faithful to us. We need to make sure we're faithful in response. So in chapter 24, he gives a summary of some of the good things that God has done with them. And they also want to be reminded, it says renewal of the covenant. Remember, it was our ancestors that made that promise to God back on Mount Sinai, not real long ago. Don't forget that. And then Joshua dies of old age, and it says where he is buried, and that is the end of the book of Joshua, the main character of the book. Okay, any questions on the book of Joshua?
No, when they conquer these cities in this land, did they kill everybody?
That's what it says.
That's what it said. That's
So, especially in these early books, there's always two answers to any question when you say, did this happen? One is, okay, that's what it says. The second answer is, okay, does that mean literally that what happened, or does it also represent? So what the point here is, especially in these books, what's the point of the entire book? Not to get focused too much on specific details, but the focus of the book is, God was faithful to his promises. God said you'd have this land. At the end of the book, you do. Practices of the people of that time were, you don't keep anything of what we would call foreigners today, or other people.
They kill everybody.
Yeah, and
no pictures.
yes. And we're going to really see this here in the next book, that a reason for that is you might pick up some of their bad habits. Actually, for those who read Bible, we're at the faith study in Kingsley this morning. That was one of the deals we were talking about, picking up some of the habits of your culture. We shouldn't kill everybody that's opposed to ours, of course. But that was their danger. Right? Well, like us too, we live in a very materialistic culture. So it's important for us not to accept those anti-Christian things in our culture while still living, because that's going to be what's happening here in the next books. They're going to be living with these other people, and it's going to tell you in advance here, whenever we practice the habits of these people that we live with, we do get into trouble. At the end of it tonight, I'll see if there's a little response to offset that a little bit. Yes, because if this were the only Bible study you were going to come to, probably not a good idea, because they're going to say, well, that's totally contrary to everything I've learned about being a Christian. Because again, there's no Christianity at this time. I will say, Jesus never quoted anything from Joshua or Judges. That is the reason for it. He referred to some people in it, but he certainly never condones any of the behavior in these two books. And that's why it's kind of important to cover all these books, because again, this is just a little time period. See what happens later. We change a little bit as time goes on, eventually we get to Jesus. And you'll also find out, not everybody is in line with this, that other people are bad. Or at least a threat to our identity. Identity is a big deal here, national identity. And we are Jewish people. Everybody, even in that area of the world today, people can still trace their ancestry back. And how important that is to say that. I can't trace mine back more than about 150 years.
They still think the Messiah is coming, so they have to have all the things.
Yeah, and that's another point. That's a religious point. Okay? So probably the most violent book is, the second most violent is probably Joshua, and the most violent is Judges. All right, so the first thing, what is a judge? It has nothing to do with what a judge is today. Okay? It's not a magistrate, it's not someone who settles legal things. It's basically your local military leader, or your local person in charge of the safety of your tribe. And as I mentioned in the handout there, the 12 are mentioned by name, but 6 of them are just given like a line or two about a summary of their lives. They're called the 6 minor judges. And then the 6 that are talked about more are called the 6 major judges. And they're referred to some in some of the later books. So, we start off the book of Judges then, first of all, the significance of what a judge is. We had Moses, we had about 20 years probably under Joshua, and now we're going to have, my professors in seminary said it's about 180 years that's talked about here in the book of Judges. And they do that because sometimes they'll talk about so-and-so was a judge for this many years, or they were at war for this many years, or they were at peace for this many years. And you try to figure it all out, so they estimate probably a little bit less than 200 years that's covered in this book. All right, so after Joshua dies, we pick it up with the judges. And we're going to start out by saying, well, you know what, even though we divided up this land, there's still lots of other people here, so we're still going to have to keep fighting, so that's why there's fighting going on. They didn't totally conquer everything like it says in Joshua. So, it gives us a little summary there of some of the extra fighting that they have to do. In chapter 2, it talks about basically what is the focus of this book, or the teaching of this book. Because what's going to happen in Judges is, sometimes they're in trouble. The enemies are beating them. And then sometimes they're doing very well. All right, and the author is saying the reason that we're doing bad when we're doing bad is because we were unfaithful to God. So we really screwed up, and then God sends us a good judge to make things better again. And then after that judge dies, if we go back to being unfaithful again, things get worse again, and then God will send a better judge and so on. So whenever we're faithful, things go well, and whenever we're not faithful, things don't go well. In one line, that's the summary of Judges. Now, when we're faithful to the covenant, things go well. And they will talk many times in here about how we forget. And, well, people talk today about how some of our young people don't know the things that they should, or whatever. You have to be taught because they maybe don't remember all the things that the old people remember. So they're saying, yeah, Caleb and Joshua were the only ones that remembered what it was like back in Egypt. And the number of us who were on Mount Sinai, not many of us. And eventually the number who remember Joshua, most of them are going to be gone. So we're not going to remember a lot of these things from the past. We need to make sure we're teaching them to our children so that they don't make the mistake of picking up the habits of the people where we're living, but instead remember what we were taught, and remember what we learned from God before our arrival here. So that is a quick summary of what the book is about. So in chapter 3, it starts with stories of the judges. So the first